The ink on my father's signature was blue. That was my first clue. My father, a man who spent 40 years building a mid-sized commercial real estate portfolio from absolute zero, was obsessively, rigidly superstitious. He never, ever signed a legally binding document in anything but black ink. It was a rule, a quirk, a standard he drilled into me since I was old enough to hold a pen, yet here I was. Sitting in a suffocatingly warm, leather-scented conference room in downtown Chicago, staring at his last will and testament. The signature was bright, glaring, undeniable blue. Across the mahogany table sat Victoria, my stepmother of exactly 3 years. She was dabbing at her dry, perfectly mascaraed eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She wore a black cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first car. "I'm just so lost without him," she whispered, her voice trembling with that practiced, fragile vibrato she used whenever she needed an audience to pity her. The estate lawyer, a balding man named Mr. Henderson who looked entirely too uncomfortable with human emotion, cleared his throat. "Yes, well, the revised will is quite clear, executed just 4 days before his sudden passing. The entirety of the estate, including the commercial properties, the primary residence, and the liquid assets, transfers solely to Victoria." I didn't blink. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table. I just stared at that blue ink. Welcome to the Revenge Diaries. If you've ever survived a toxic betrayal, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Your support helps expose these manipulators, and trust me, what you are about to hear is going to make you want to check your own bank statements. "Are you sure, Mark?" Victoria asked, suddenly looking directly at me. The fragile victim act vanished from her eyes for a split second, replaced by a cold, calculating gleam. "You're awfully quiet. Your father wanted us to be taken care of, both of us, but he knew I needed the security." She was gaslighting me in real time. She was trying to gauge if I was going to be a problem. "I'm fine, Victoria," I said, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion. "It is what it is." I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of the office. I didn't look back. I knew that if I showed a single ounce of anger, if I threatened a lawsuit right then and there, she would immediately begin hiding the evidence. I needed her to believe she had won. I needed her to feel safe. Because when a narcissist feels safe, they get sloppy. The moment I got to my car, my hand started shaking, not from grief, from pure, unadulterated adrenaline. My father had been in a medically induced coma for 6 days before his passing. This new will was dated 4 days before he died, which meant mathematically, medically, and legally, he couldn't have signed it. Victoria had forged the will. She had stolen a $15 million estate with a blue ballpoint pen and a crooked notary. I didn't go to the police. The police are reactive. They want smoking guns and taped confessions. If I went to the authorities with nothing but a suspicion about blue ink and a coma timeline, Victoria's high-priced lawyers would tie the investigation up in probate court for a decade. She would slowly liquidate the assets, drain the accounts, and disappear. No, I didn't need the police. I needed a ghost. 3 days later, I found myself in a windowless basement-level office in the financial district. The air hummed with the sound of server racks. Sitting behind a desk cluttered with empty coffee cups and shredded documents was Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a private investigator. Arthur was a forensic accountant. But in the underground circles of corporate warfare, Arthur was known as the Eraser. He didn't just find hidden money, he weaponized it. He was a man who could look at a spreadsheet and tell you what a CEO had for breakfast based on his petty cash receipts. I placed a photocopy of the forged will on his desk. Arthur didn't look up from his monitors. He just pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "I charge $600 an hour. I don't do domestic disputes. I don't do tax evasion. What is this?" "A $15 million theft," I said. "My stepmother forged my father's will while he was in a coma. The estate lawyer is already processing the transfer of assets. I need to know exactly what she's doing with the money before she vanishes." Arthur finally stopped typing. He picked up the photocopy with 2 fingers, analyzing the notary stamp at the bottom of the page. Notary's name is David Vance, Arthur muttered, his eyes narrowing. Interesting. What's interesting about it? I know a David Vance, Arthur said, tossing the paper back onto the desk. He lost his notary license 3 years ago for backdating mortgage deeds in a foreclosure scam. If this is the same guy, your stepmother didn't just forge a will. She committed federal wire fraud if she's already moving the cash. Arthur turned his chair fully toward me. The glow of the monitors caught the sharp angles of his face. If I take this case, we don't just sue her. We don't settle. We track every single cent she moves. We build a financial cage out of her own transactions, and we drop the trap when she has absolutely nowhere left to run. Is that understood? I don't want a settlement, I told him, my voice like ice. I want her ruined, Arthur smiled, a cold, terrifying smile. Give me 24 hours. The next day, I had to play the dutiful stepson. Victoria insisted on hosting a celebration of life at my father's house, the house that was supposed to be mine. I walked into the foyer and found her holding court in the living room, surrounded by my father's business associates. She was wearing a stunning black dress, clutching a crystal glass of bourbon. She looked like a grieving widow on the outside, but I could see the subtle, arrogant lift of her chin. She was the queen of the castle now. Mark, darling, she cooed, walking over and placing a cold hand on my cheek. I had to force every muscle in my body not to pull away. I was just telling the board members how your father wanted me to step in and oversee the liquidation of the downtown properties. It's what he would have wanted. Liquidation. She was already cashing out. I'm sure you'll handle it exactly how he would have, I said, pasting on a blank, subservient smile. I'm glad you understand, she whispered, leaning in close so only I could hear. The smell of her expensive perfume was nauseating. Your father knew you weren't ready to handle this kind of wealth, Mark. This is for the best. You get a nice little allowance, and I handle the heavy lifting. She patted my chest, turned, and walked away. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Arthur. Get out of there. Come to the office. Now. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I slipped out the back door, got in my car, and broke 3 speed limits getting to the financial district. When I burst into Arthur's basement office, the air felt different, electric. Arthur was standing by a massive whiteboard, holding a red, dry erase marker. The board was covered in Swift codes, routing numbers, and shell company names that made no sense to me. She's moving fast, Arthur said, not even turning around as I locked the door behind me. Faster than I anticipated. She's not just liquidating the properties, Mark. She's actively draining the corporate reserve accounts. How? I demanded, stepping closer to the board. The probate hasn't even fully cleared yet. She used the forged will to secure an emergency bridge loan against the estate's total value, Arthur explained, tapping a set of numbers on the board. It's highly illegal, but with the right fraudulent paperwork and a crooked notary, it works. She secured $4.2 million in cash yesterday afternoon. My stomach dropped. Where is the money? Arthur walked over to his keyboard and hit the spacebar. The massive monitor on the wall woke up, displaying a complex web of digital transactions. She broke the $4 million into 50 smaller wires to avoid triggering immediate SEC red flags, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low predatory register. She routed them through a dummy LLC in Delaware. From Delaware, the money bounced to a holding company in the British Virgin Islands. Arthur clicked the mouse, and a red line shot across the digital map on the screen. And 30 minutes ago, it landed here, Arthur said. The screen zoomed in on a banking logo. Cayman Islands. Offshore, I whispered. She's hiding it where U.S. courts can't easily freeze it. Exactly, Arthur said, sitting back in his chair. She's smart. The Cayman account is heavily encrypted. It operates under a blind trust, meaning the name on the account isn't Victoria's. Then whose is it? I asked, my heart pounding in my throat. Arthur turned to me, his eyes wide behind his glasses. He hit one final button on the keyboard. A decrypted digital banking document flashed onto the screen. That's the thing, Mark, Arthur said quietly. She didn't wire the money to herself. I stepped closer to the monitor, reading the name of the primary beneficiary on the Cayman Islands Blind Trust. My blood ran completely cold. It wasn't Victoria. It wasn't the crooked notary. The name on the offshore account holding my father's stolen millions was mine. TMI name. The words barely made it past my lips. The basement office felt like a vacuum. The humming of Arthur's server rack suddenly sounded deafening. Look at the screen, Mark, Arthur said. His voice was completely devoid of panic. It was clinical, cold. She didn't just set up an offshore account, she set up a digital trap, and your neck is resting perfectly inside it. I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the heavily encrypted banking manifest on the glowing monitor. There it was. Account holder, Mark Elias Thorne. I don't understand, I whispered, my mind racing to catch up with the sheer scale of the deception. Why would she put the money in my name? She stole it. She forged the will to take everything. Arthur sighed. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses, pulling a microfiber cloth from his desk drawer, and began polishing the lenses slowly. Because, Mark, stealing $15 million is loud. It leaves a massive, unignorable paper trail. When the probate court inevitably flags a sudden, desperate liquidation of your father's commercial properties, the IRS is going to ask questions. The authorities might even open a federal inquiry. Victoria knows this. She's not trying to outrun the law. She's directing the law straight at you. I felt a sickening knot twist deep in my stomach. A frame job, I said. A masterpiece of a frame job, Arthur corrected, sliding his glasses back onto his face. Think about the narrative she's building right now. The grieving widow, the bitter disinherited son. If the authorities trace that $4.2 million bridge loan, they won't find Victoria's digital signature. They'll find a dummy LLC in Delaware that traces back to a Cayman Islands blind trust, registered directly to your social security number. She's going to tip off the auditors anonymously. And I go to federal prison for embezzling my own father's estate, I finished. The reality crashed down on me like an anvil. Exactly, Arthur said, typing furiously on his mechanical keyboard. She keeps the remaining $10 million in pristine real estate. You get locked away for 20 years. You lose the ability to ever legally contest the forged will. It's checkmate. I stared at the blinking cursor on Arthur's secondary monitor. My father had warned me about her. She's sharp, Mark, he used to say, swirling his bourbon. She looks at people like they are chess pieces. I had underestimated her, but I swore, right then and there in that freezing basement, that I wasn't going to do it again. So, what do we do? I asked. My hands had completely stopped shaking. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. Do we freeze the account? Do we call the bank compliance office? No, Arthur snapped. We freeze the account, she gets an automated security alert. She ghosts the connection, burns the digital trail, and walks away with complete plausible deniability. We don't defend, Mark, we attack. Arthur brought up a black command terminal. Strings of bright green code began raining down the screen. To access a blind trust in the Caymans, Arthur explained, you need two things: a physical hardware key, usually a secure USB token, and a dynamic authenticator app. Victoria has both, but she's paranoid. She won't access that account from her phone on a public network. She's doing it from a secure static IP address. The estate, I realized. My father's house. She's using his private network in the home office. Arthur nodded. She's routing her connection through a private network tunnel, but the origin point is the house. If she finalizes the transfer from the holding company into the blind trust, she locks the money in your name permanently. We have to intercept the authorization handshake. In English, Arthur. I need you to go back to the house, Arthur said, turning in his chair to look me dead in the eye. I need you to plant a hardware clone on her router. It's a passive interceptor, the size of a flash drive. When she logs into the Cayman account, my servers will instantly mirror her session. I'll rip the security token data, lock her out, and take complete administrative control of the trust. And if she catches me, then you go to prison, Arthur said bluntly, and I bill your estate for my hours. An hour later, I was pulling my car back into the long, winding driveway of my father's estate. The celebration of life was officially over. The caterers were packing up the crystal champagne flutes into white vans. The driveway was mostly empty, save for Victoria's black SUV parked near the front doors. I reached into my coat pocket. My fingers brushed against the cold metal of the interceptor drive Arthur had handed me. It felt impossibly heavy. Get to the router in the home office, plug it in. Keep her distracted for exactly 3 minutes while the drive downloads the network logs. That was the mission. Simple, terrifying. I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors. The house was dead quiet. Mark, her voice floated out from the living room, sharp and melodic. I found Victoria sitting on the white leather sofa. Her designer heels were kicked off, a half-empty bottle of incredibly expensive Merlot resting on the glass coffee table in front of her. The fragile, grieving widow act was completely gone. She looked relaxed, triumphant. "I thought you left," she said, taking a slow, measured sip of her wine. "I forgot my coat," I lied, keeping my voice perfectly level. I forced myself to walk further into the room. "And I wanted to apologize." Victoria raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Apologize?" "For how I acted at the lawyer's office," I said. I sat down in the armchair opposite her. I had to sell this. I had to play the broken, defeated son who was ready to give up. "You were right. Dad knew I wasn't ready to handle the business. I felt blindsided." Victoria stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. Her eyes were like black glass. "Grief makes us irrational, Mark," she said softly. But the corner of her mouth twitched upward. She was enjoying this. She was feeding on my total surrender. "I know," I said, leaning forward, clasping my hands together to hide the tension in my knuckles. "I just want peace, Victoria. I don't want a massive legal battle. I don't want to fight you in court. If Dad wanted you to have control, then I accept his wishes." She smiled. It was a terrifying, deeply predatory smile. "I am so glad to hear you say that, Mark," she purred, setting her wine glass down gracefully. "We are family after all, and family protects each other. I'll make sure your allowance is generous. You won't have to worry about a single thing." 3 minutes. I stood up, offering her a weak, submissive smile. "I'm going to grab my coat from the study. I'll let you get some rest." "Take your time, darling," she said, already reaching for the television remote. I walked out of the living room and down the long, shadowed hallway toward my father's home office. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs I thought it was going to crack my chest wide open. I pushed open the heavy oak door and slipped inside, quietly clicking the lock shut behind me. The room still smelled exactly like him. Rich leather, aged scotch, and old parchment. But I didn't have time to mourn. I rushed behind the massive mahogany desk. The network router was tucked on a lower shelf, a blinking hub of blue and green lights hidden behind a stack of corporate binders. I pulled the interceptor drive from my pocket. My hands were slick with cold sweat. I found the open port on the back of the router and shoved the drive in. A tiny red LED on the drive began to pulse. 1 minute. Arthur had told me it would take exactly 3 minutes for the drive to index the local network and bypass the internal firewall. I stood up, pretending to look in the closet for a coat I hadn't brought. 2 minutes. The silence in the house was suffocating. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a thunderclap. Suddenly the doorknob rattled. Ice froze in my veins. "Mark?" Victoria's voice echoed through the thick wood of the door. "Is the door locked?" I scrambled back to the desk. The LED on the drive was still pulsing red. It wasn't done. It needed more time. "Yeah, sorry," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "I think the heavy latch is stuck. Just a second." "Open the door, Mark," she commanded. The sweet, motherly tone was entirely gone. Her voice was razor sharp. "Dangerous." "Come on, Arthur," I prayed, staring at the flashing red light. "Come on." The doorknob rattled violently. She had a key. I heard the sharp metallic click of a key sliding smoothly into the lock cylinder. 3 minutes. The red LED on the drive flashed twice, then turned a solid, steady green. I ripped the drive out of the router and shoved it deep into my pocket just as the office door swung open. Victoria stood in the doorway. Her eyes darted wildly around the double room, landing on me standing awkwardly by the leather armchair. "What are you doing in here?" she demanded, stepping quickly into the room. "Just looking for my coat," I said, stepping away from the desk and holding my hands up defensively. "I must have left it in the car. My mistake." She didn't believe me. I could see the paranoia clicking violently behind her eyes. She walked slowly to the desk, her eyes scanning the surface, the drawers, the computer monitor. "You shouldn't be in here, Mark," she whispered, never taking her eyes off the desk. "This is my office now." "I know," I said, walking past her toward the open door. "Good night, Victoria." I didn't wait for her to reply. I walked straight out of the house, got into my car, and drove away without turning my headlights on until I was half a mile down the main road. 40 minutes later, I slammed the interceptor drive down on Arthur's desk. "I got it," I gasped, entirely out of breath. She almost caught me, but I got the data. Arthur didn't say a single word. He grabbed the drive, plugged it directly into his secure terminal, and immediately began typing. Lines of decrypted network logs flooded his massive screen. "Incredible," Arthur murmured, leaning so close his nose almost touched the monitor. "She is so arrogant. She didn't even configure a secondary firewall." "Do you have the login token?" I asked, pacing back and forth in the cramped basement. "Can we lock her out of the Cayman account?" "I'm isolating her digital footprint right now," Arthur said, his eyes scanning the code. "I'm routing her hardware address into a proxy mirror. When she tries to log in to finalize the transfer, she's going to hit my server, not the bank's." Suddenly, a piercing alarm began blaring from Arthur's desktop speakers. A massive red notification flashed across his primary monitor. Authentication protocol initiated. "She's doing it," Arthur said, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard in a blur. "She realized you were snooping around the desk. She's panicked. She's trying to push the $4.2 million into the blind trust right now." "Stop her," I yelled. "I am," Arthur replied calmly. "I'm intercepting the two-factor authentication ping. I have the hardware token sequence, and bypass successful. We are in." The red warning screen vanished, replaced instantly by the sleek, minimalist interface of the Cayman Islands banking portal. We had complete control. Victoria was locked out, staring at a frozen screen in my father's office, completely unaware that a master forensic accountant was sitting inside her offshore bank account. "We did it," I breathed, collapsing into the spare chair. "The money is secure. We can redirect it back to the estate. We can finally prove she initiated the wire fraud." Arthur didn't celebrate. He was completely silent, staring intensely at a sub-menu on the banking portal. "Arthur?" I asked, the relief draining from my voice. "What is it?" "Mark," Arthur said slowly. His voice had lost its confident, clinical edge. He sounded deeply disturbed. "Victoria didn't set up this blind trust." "What do you mean? You said she forged the will to secure the bridge loan to route the money here." "She did," Arthur said, clicking a restricted file labeled Beneficiary History. "She routed the stolen money into this exact account today. But this account wasn't created today. It wasn't created this week." Arthur turned his primary monitor so I could see it clearly. "This Cayman account was opened 7 years ago," Arthur said softly. "It has been receiving weekly automated deposits of $50,000 directly from your father's corporate reserve accounts for nearly a decade." I felt the color drain completely from my face. "My father? My father was hiding money offshore?" "No," Arthur said, hitting another key. A scanned document appeared on the high-definition screen. It was a heavily redacted, legally binding corporate employment contract. "Your father didn't open this account. Victoria didn't open this account." Arthur zoomed in on the final signature at the very bottom of the 7-year-old contract. It was signed in stark, undeniable, obsessively rigid black ink. "Your father didn't just meet Victoria 3 years ago, Mark," Arthur whispered, the harsh glow of the screen illuminating the absolute shock on his face. "He hired her." I stared at the black ink on the screen. Victoria wasn't just a gold-digging stepmother. She was an employee of a shadow corporation, and my father had been paying her for 7 years. An employee. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. I leaned over Arthur's desk, my eyes scanning the harsh black ink of my father's signature on the digital document. "A high-level corporate. Proxy," Arthur corrected, his voice a low, clinical murmur. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, pulling up secondary ledgers. 7 years ago, your father's commercial portfolio was expanding aggressively. He was navigating hostile takeovers. He needed a buffer. Someone to act as a legal shield between his personal assets and his corporate liabilities. So he hired Victoria. "He hired Victoria Vance," Arthur said, tapping the screen. "A former corporate compliance officer who was quietly blacklisted from Wall Street for ethical flexibility. He paid her $50,000 a month. Her job was to manage his proxy shells, to be the public face on documents he didn't want his name on." "And the marriage?" I asked, feeling a cold wave of absolute disgust wash over me. "A tax strategy," Arthur said bluntly. "Spousal privilege. If your father was ever audited or investigated, a wife cannot be legally compelled to testify against her husband. It was the ultimate non-disclosure agreement. My father didn't fall in love. He bought a human vault." "But the vault got greedy," I whispered, the pieces finally falling into a terrifying, perfect puzzle. "Exactly," Arthur said, leaning back in his chair. "When your father went into that coma, Victoria knew the arrangement was over. The employment contract would dissolve upon his passing. She would be left with nothing but her monthly retainer, so she called her brother. The notary, I realized. David Vance. Bingo. They forged the new will using a blue ballpoint pen because they were panicked and rushed. They backdated it, but they knew the IRS would eventually flag a sudden transfer of $15 million to a proxy wife. Arthur brought up the frozen Cayman Islands portal on his main monitor. "So, she used the architecture your father built against him," Arthur explained, pointing to the blind trust. "Your father originally set this Cayman account up for you, Mark. It was an emergency fund, clean money, hidden safely away. Victoria knew the account existed. She hijacked the routing numbers, secured the fraudulent $4.2 million bridge loan against the estate, and wired it directly into your name. She was going to anonymously tip off the authorities," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "I go to federal prison for embezzling from my own estate. The government seizes the Cayman account, and Victoria plays the innocent victimized widow who gets to keep the remaining $10 million in commercial properties. It was brilliant. It was ruthless, and it was completely dismantled." "She's locked out of the Caymans," Arthur said, a dangerous razor-sharp smile spreading across his face. "I have redirected the administrative keys to my server. The $4 million is secured, but she doesn't know that yet. Right now, Victoria is sitting in your father's house, frantically hitting refresh on a frozen screen, wondering why her wire transfer hasn't cleared. How long until she realizes she's been intercepted?" "She's a corporate shark," Arthur said, checking his watch. "She'll know by morning, which means we have less than 12 hours to drop the cage." I looked at the forensic accountant, the man who lived in the shadows. "I don't want to just stop her, Arthur. I want to ruin her. I want her to leave with absolutely nothing." Arthur stood up. He grabbed a blank flash drive from his drawer. "Then we don't use lawyers, Mark. We use leverage." 48 hours later, the leather-scented conference room in downtown Chicago felt exactly the same. The heavy mahogany table, the suffocating warmth. I sat in the exact same chair I had occupied when this nightmare began, but this time I wasn't alone. Arthur sat to my right. He wore an immaculate dark charcoal suit. He didn't bring a briefcase. He didn't bring a laptop. He brought a single manila folder. At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy glass doors swung open. Victoria walked in. She looked pristine, a tailored white pantsuit, oversized designer sunglasses, and that practiced aura of untouchable wealth. But as she pulled her sunglasses down, I saw it. The dark circles under her eyes. The microscopic tremor in her hand as she clutched her expensive handbag. She was cracking. Mr. Henderson, the balding estate lawyer, walked in behind her, looking characteristically nervous. "Mark?" Victoria said, her voice tight, completely dropping. "The grieving widow act." She glared at Arthur. "Who is this? What is the meaning of this emergency meeting?" "Sit down, Victoria," I said. My voice was dangerously calm. "I will not sit down." She paused. The absolute zero temperature of my voice caught her off guard. Slowly, carefully, she took the seat across from me. Mr. Henderson sat beside her, nervously opening his legal pad. "Mr. Thorne requested this meeting to finalize the transfer of the primary commercial assets," Mr. Henderson started, his voice wavering. "However, I must inform you that the probate court has hit a slight delay. We are showing an unauthorized encumbrance on the estate, a bridge loan of $4 million. Victoria's eyes darted to me. Panic flared, just for a fraction of a second. "A banking error, I'm sure," Victoria lied smoothly. "I will have my financial team look into it." Arthur leaned forward. He didn't introduce himself. He just slid the manila folder across the mahogany table. "It's not an error, Ms. Vance," Arthur said. Victoria completely froze. Hearing her maiden name in this room was like a gunshot. "I suggest you open the folder," Arthur whispered. With trembling fingers, Victoria flipped open the manila cover. The first page was a high-resolution screenshot of her frozen Cayman Islands banking portal, complete with the exact timestamp of her failed login attempt from my father's home network. The second page was a forensic audit of the bridge loan, tracing every single one of the 50 microwires directly back to the dummy LLC she set up, with her brother. The third page was a copy of the notary logbook belonging to David Vance, cross-referenced with his disbarment records. Victoria couldn't breathe. Her mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. She looked at the documents, then at Arthur, then at me. The arrogant queen was gone. She was a rat trapped in a digital maze. "You have no authority," she finally managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. "This is illegally obtained data." "I'm a forensic consultant," Arthur said smoothly, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "I don't need a warrant to monitor my client's own estate network. You utilized a corporate server to commit federal wire fraud. That data legally belongs to Mark." Mr. Henderson, the estate lawyer, leaned over and glanced at the documents. His face drained of all color. He pushed his chair back, distancing himself from Victoria as if she were suddenly radioactive. "Victoria," I said, leaning over the table, forcing her to look me in the eye. "My father hired you to be a shield, but you forgot one fundamental rule about shields. They are disposable." "What do you want?" she hissed, dropping the facade entirely. Pure venom dripped from her words. "You think you can send me to prison? The scandal will destroy your father's company. The SEC will audit every property you own." "Maybe," I replied, perfectly unfazed. "But I have $15 million and the best forensic accountant in the country to navigate that audit. You have a brother who is going to flip on you. The second the FBI knocks on his door to avoid a 20-year sentence for backdating fraudulent legal documents." She swallowed hard. The reality was setting in. "Here's how this ends, Victoria," I said, keeping my voice low, authoritative, and utterly terrifying. "There will be no trial. There will be no public scandal. We are going to erase you." Arthur slid a second, much thinner document across the table. "This is a confession of judgment and an irrevocable release of claim," Arthur explained, tapping the paper. "It states that you voluntarily relinquish all rights, titles, and interests in the Thorne estate. It states that you acknowledge the recent will was drafted under erroneous circumstances, and you are reverting full executorship back to the original document, meaning Mark." "If I sign this, I leave with nothing," Victoria whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "I gave 7 years of my life to that man's company. You were paid handsomely for those 7 years. I countered coldly. This document leaves you with your freedom. That is my final offer. I leaned back in my chair, steepled my fingers, and watched her mind race. And if I refuse, she challenged, trying to find a shred of leverage. Arthur smiled. It was the same cold, predatory smile I had seen in his basement office. I have a dead man switch on my servers, Ms. Vance, Arthur said. If this release is not signed and filed with the probate court by noon today, an encrypted data packet will automatically unseal. It will simultaneously deliver these forensic logs to the SEC Division of Enforcement, the FBI White-Collar Crime Unit, and the State Licensing Board for Notaries Public. Arthur leaned in close. They will freeze your personal accounts by dinner. They will arrest your brother by midnight, and you will spend the next 2 decades in a federal facility. Silence fell over the room, heavy, crushing, absolute silence. Victoria looked at the mountain of undeniable digital evidence. She looked at the panicked estate lawyer who was already mentally drafting his own defense. And then, she looked at me. She knew she had lost. There was no charm left to use, no gaslighting left to manipulate, just cold, hard, inescapable leverage. Her hands shook violently as she reached into her designer handbag. She pulled out a pen. It was a silver, heavily engraved fountain pen. "Wait," I commanded sharply. Victoria froze. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a cheap plastic pen, the kind you buy in a 10-pack at a pharmacy. I tossed it onto the mahogany table. It clattered loudly, rolling until it stopped, right in front of her perfectly manicured hands. "My father never signed a legally binding document in blue ink," I said softly, the weight of the moment pressing down on the room. "And neither will you." Victoria stared at the cheap plastic pen. A tear finally escaped her eye, a real one this time, cutting through her flawless makeup. She picked up the pen, she uncapped it, and with a shaking, defeated hand, Victoria signed her entire empire away in stark, permanent, undeniable black. Ink Mr. Henderson immediately took the document, stamped it, and scurried out of the room to file the paperwork, eager to save his own reputation. Victoria stood up. She didn't look at me. She didn't say a single word. She just picked up her handbag and walked out of the heavy glass doors, disappearing into the Chicago skyline, ruined, silenced, erased. Arthur stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. He picked up the manila folder. "An absolute pleasure doing business with you, Mark," Arthur said smoothly. "I'll send my invoice to your primary office." "You earned every penny, Arthur." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room, looking down at the sprawling city below. The properties my father built. The empire that was almost stolen by a ghost in a cashmere sweater. The money was secured. The trap had closed flawlessly. Justice wasn't served in a courtroom, it was served in a spreadsheet. And as I looked at the black signature on the copy of the release form, I knew my father's legacy was finally safe. That concludes this story on the Revenge Diaries. If you loved watching a manipulative narcissist walk right into a financial trap, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment down below and tell me, what is the biggest red flag you've ever ignored in a toxic relationship? Stay sharp, protect your assets, and remember, the digital trail never lies. I'll see you in the next entry.